And the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Hello and welcome to the only independent news and opinion program where we get to chronicle two distinct possibilities, either the demise and possible extinction of the Homo sapien or the greatest leap forward in all of human history. One thing is certain, there is no status quo. This is the Daily Australian Radio Show, episode 50 for Friday, March 14th, 2025. I am one of two of your hosts, Jason Olborn, and I'm joined right now by the superstar news editor-in-chief, Nicola Charles. Welcome back. Happy Friday.
Thanks, Jason. Hello, listeners. You know that's not true. You know you're the editor-in-chief. What can I say? Happy birthday to us. It's good being 50, right? No, not really. But
well, I would like to say in my cricket terms, you know, an applause for the half century, everyone. Thanks very much. You know, it's not a little thing to put together 50 radio shows, technically in a row. So this is the end of our 10th week in existence, which basically means our first quarter is around the corner. I have to say I'm pretty proud of what we've been able to achieve thus far in putting together a show that we intuitively arrived at together, knowing that there was something desperately needed in the independent media, in the Australian media, and even in the global space, a conversation between two like-minded people with very different opinions on a lot of things, and being able to debate them and present the facts and invite the audience in. Red pill, black pill, it's kind of cool, and I'm really proud of what we've been able to achieve.
I think professionally it's called a body of work now, isn't it? We've done so many, and we've definitely pinged something in the Australian brain because we get a lot of feedback. But, I remember it was definitely, if you believe in such things, it was a spiritual moment for me because you and I had worked together before and I thought we need to work together again. And this is why, for the good of Australia. And you're the same, Jason. We often get things that come along that I think this is why it's good when you collaborate. You know, someone has an idea or does an interview and it sparks something in the other's brain. And we've got different connections and different information coming in from different parts of the world, which is really important to the listener. Now, you did that incredible, I have to say, interview. I didn't have any expectations of it, I'll be honest, from Trevor Loudon, who's written this amazing book about Anthony Albanese called Comrade PM. And I went to bed at 10 o'clock last night, and then I woke up at midnight, and I keep this notepad next to my book, and my brain just started pinging with connections. So I just want to read out my notes. The first thing I thought of was Klaus Schwab when he said over and over, "I admire a rising China." Now, I believe Biden also said something similar. And I thought, well, how come China can pollute the planet, but we can't? In our 1% of responsibility in Australia, we can't. Then there's this, clear evidence from Trevor Loudon of Anthony Albanese, Daniel Andrews and Penny Wong almost being categorized as sort of sleeper cell communists within Australia, doing the wrong thing and potentially taking China's money to assist with what you could describe in politics as a coup d'etat. And then I wrote down Albo's dollars and his new beach house for 4.6 million. Then I wrote down Dutton's dollars, hundreds of millions apparently. Then I wrote down warships, Chinese, unfettered, no checks and balances, floating around the outskirts of Australia. And then I thought about these meetings which emerged, which are phenomenal. Well, a meeting, what was described as a public meeting, a political meeting, that turned out to be a contradiction in terms because it actually wasn't a public meeting because the Australian public weren't allowed in. And honestly, when you add that together with COVID and the pandemic and China and the Wuhan lab, I actually thought at midnight last night, surely this has to be, Jason, the end of the ALP, the end of the Australian Labor Party. too many things are coming together to show that Australians are actually being marginalized. Now, also, as a sidebar, these communists have infiltrated Indigenous tribes. You've got Thomas Mayo, who's an announced communist trying to radicalize people within tribes. And then there was the comment, the last note was Benny Johnson, when he said publicly and strangely, "We will save you, Australia." Save us from what, Jason? I think there's something really big and quite dangerous going on in our country.
I think that the story that Bruyne of Chriscoveries and Morgan Jonas, who I don't know if Morgan was actually there, maybe he was, but he reported it himself. I think that this particular story, and I'm giving all credit to Chris, could well be the story of the century. I think that Chris, and he's holding back, and he's a very, very good reporter. And I'll tell you right now, and everything, I wear my heart on my sleeve. Chris and I have had disagreements in the past, but we've agreed on much more than we've disagreed. We've even almost come to fisticuffs in certain situations. And full credit to him. That means that he is the genuine article.
A battler.
As annoying as Chris can be to some people and to me as well, he is a brilliant reporter, as good as anyone on the ground in Australia. He's as good as Avi Yemeni is. He's better than anyone you'll get on Channel 9 or A Current Affair. And what he did to go in and point something out is mind-blowing.
Shocking.
Now, I think by now, I think over 300,000 or 400,000 people have seen it on X. I'd say that would be distributed today. It'll probably be up around the million. It's starting to get a groundswell of observation, pardon me, amongst those within the political circles. I know that Jared Rennick's having a look at it to see to form his own opinion. I've sent it out to friends at the Libertarians to see what their opinion is, to see if they're even aware of it. But in the first instances, what we were able to do yesterday, and by having Trevor Loudon. And please go check out the interview if you haven't already. It is mind-blowing. The fact that Trevor had previously written, only recently published this new book, Comrade PM, and pardon me, and goes into great detail about the communist origins of Albanese and his political ideology spanning some 40 years, at the exact same time that we see what's going on here in Melbourne, in the seat of Deakin. Yeah. Now, it is a heavily populated Chinese community in Box Hill in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. You had police. What were police doing there anyway at what was just an invited situation?
And the look on those policemen's faces to ordinary, everyday Australians was chilling, Jason.
It certainly was. It reeked of Dan Andrews' COVID Victoria all over again. Why weren't there just security guards there, for goodness sake? Now, Labor has a terrible reputation of being the aggressor, not the receiver of aggression. There was no aggression there whatsoever. People spoke beautifully, and were questioning what was going on. It was all recorded, and you could clearly see that this Chinese gent just walked straight through the police as if he was known. And other people were being rejected despite having bona fides. They had invitations, they had their names, they'd given their identification. It was way over the top.
They said, "Do you live locally?" And they said, "Yes." And I received this and I responded and I got a ticket.
Extraordinary. So then you see, and this is what blew my mind, because I played that footage for Trevor, who hadn't seen it before, and I asked him, and we're going to play this for you in a moment, and it's contained in the full 45-minute interview, but we've also cut it into about 5 minutes for friendliness on this show, and you can now get that on my X page if you just want to watch the 5 minutes. But I threw it to him, and the first thing he brings up is Karina Garland. Now, no one who in the general population would be aware of this particular name. And he immediately recognised it. I didn't even see the name on the poster. And he pointed out that she was part of this search group that is the
Search Foundation.
Search Foundation, yeah. which is the communist extension of the ALP. So there it is.
Yeah.
So we now have known communists inviting a Chinese-only audience. We have Daniel Andrews, Mr. Belt and Road Initiative, that went against Australian rules at the time.
Well, he was meant to be there and didn't rock up. Tell us about that.
Well, isn't it interesting that Andrews is the keynote speaker, and at the last minute pulls out of it? So he must be aware that there are cameras around. So Daniel Andrews is operating in the shadows. We've seen pictures that were given to me by some ex-military personnel of him apparently on his way to China a couple of months ago. In fact, it was more than that. It was around the time that Tucker Carlson was in Australia. This photograph was circulating that Andrews was flying to a specific meeting to meet with certain Chinese officials in the dark of night. I'm going to have to dig that up again, and we're going to track that story a little bit further. So here's technically where we're headed with this. We are now asking: is Daniel Andrews, Penny Wong, Karina Garland, do they have any direct Chinese Communist Party affiliation? Are they receiving money? Are they taking instruction? Because it looks like it is the story of the century underneath the surface. There is going to be denial, obfuscation. There is going to be radio silence. There is going to be absolute distancing from this particular story. But what we've now learned, and the fact that Trevor was able to pick up on it immediately, some will say that's a confirmation bias. I'm saying listen to what he's got to say. I'm then going to tell you a little bit about his book, and this is all before we get into the breaking news bulletin of today, because the news of the day is massive, Nicola. Let's play it for you now. Last night, it turns out that several people were denied entry to Box Hill Town Hall in Victoria, where Dan Andrews was scheduled to speak. Despite having valid tickets, some were denied entry, with very few exceptions, were white Australians, according to Morgan Jonas and Bruyne of Chriscoveries. Now, people said that they knew for a fact, because they had Chinese Australian friends who were granted admission, that event staff were indeed allowing in people who had not booked tickets in advance if they happened to be of East Asian appearance. Why the double standard? What's going on with the Labor Party? I'll get you to have a look at this, and then we'll get on with the show proper.
Happy to sign in. They're only allowing people of a very specific archetype in these doors. It's a closed doors meeting.
We're here to attend what's a public meeting, but apparently, if you've got a ticket, it is a positive ballot.
They just said that's not with us. That's not part of this event.
I've got my ticket. I rang up and I confirmed it, and I'm happy to sign in and give my details.
Yeah.
And I'm here to, got this in the mailbox about.
So you got this in the mail. Are you local?
Yes.
So is it Matt Gregg, your film?
Local. So I'm here to speak to him.
There you go.
And they still won't let me in to see what he's got to say.
Unbelievable. So locals are getting these in the mail, and they're coming here, registering their name, registering their address, talking to the police, not being allowed in closed doors. Penny Wong, why has Labor been restricting freedom of speech for Australians? Can you answer to that? Why weren't Australians allowed in tonight to this event? Why were only Chinese people allowed in?
What do you think, just as an observer with a lot of experience in researching, what was your take on that short video clip that we saw out of Victoria last night?
Well, I noticed that Daniel Andrews was supposed to be on the bill, and so was Karina Garland. Daniel Andrews is extreme left, in bed with China for a very long time, and Karina Garland is very, very close to the Search Foundation, the continuation of the old Communist Party of Australia. And both of these, what they've been doing is really courting ethnic minorities. And that's part of the reason for the big upsurge in migration during Albanese's term, because the goal is to, as they have done in Canada, to import millions of Chinese and similar people into the country, not because of their race so much, but because of their political affiliation, their political background, their connections to the CCP and other foreign governments. And this is part of the subversive process for turning Australia into a socialist, communist nation. So it was quite interesting to see Karina Garland, Daniel Andrews, and making sure that only ethnic people were getting into the meeting, because the ethnic people are the main target for the left. That's immigration bears that out. But not just immigration, there's two systems in Australia, one for your traditional Australians and one for minorities. And that's always been a part of the Marxist program. You have the old Communist Party of Australia of the 80s now in charge in your country. And they are going to push it as far as they can. They want full-on socialism in Australia, full-on. And they've got their man. If they can get their man back in, you're going to get it. And if you think it's tough now, you wait and see what it's like in 2 or 3 years.
It's a really interesting point you make, because we've only learnt this week that that Trump has imposed the tariffs on Australian aluminium and steel, and you would therefore think that that's going to weaken Albanese in the eyes of the electorate in the lead up to the election, and it's given Peter Dutton, certainly the opposition leader, a little bit of chance to have a dig back at Albanese, who's been after Dutton for financial irregularities, if you will. But Dutton's saying he can't even get Trump on the phone, so that looks like it's. I mean, politics is all about theatre and optics. It's an incredible scenario that we're in, Trevor.
Yeah, look, it's very, very hard to figure this out, isn't it? Just what the games are being played here. But we got to change what we can change, and Australians have an opportunity to change Australia for the better in a couple of months' time. And I put the book out to get as many Australians to understand as possible that if they vote for Albanese, they're not voting for the Labor Party of Bob Hawke. They are voting for a communist party. And if they understood that fact, they would not do it. And so, that book's 398 pages or 392 pages, full of photographs, full of communist documents, full of all sorts of evidence that's never been presented to the Australian people. You don't come to a foreign country and tell people their leader is basically a traitor, unless you have the evidence to back it up. And, I've had a lot of people proof that book, and nobody's said to me, Trevor, you can't back that up. This is in their own words. These are their own documents. I've done some pretty deep dives on these people, and it ain't just Albanese, it's Bernie, it's a whole bunch of his cabinet ministers. This goes way beyond Albanese. He's just the top of the.
That is extraordinary.
That's foreign interference in Australia, Jason. That's what that is. And that is unlawful. It's illegal. It's all of those things. Foreign interference in our democracy is unlawful. Why are Australians being shut out of public meetings? That is a contradiction. It's not a public meeting if the public can't go in. What that is a meeting of what? Chinese communists, and we're shut out of in what? A suburb of Melbourne, Box Hill. Extraordinary, Jason.
I can't believe it. And look, just full credit again to Chriscoveries. Please check him out at Chriscoveries on X. You probably already have, but I know he's got quite a big following on Facebook, but like me, just a small following here on X. I think he's up to about 9,000. Let's see if we can get Chris to 25,000 over the weekend. He deserves it. A brilliant, brilliant Australian reporter on the ground. And I have to say, you can also check out on my page or on his interview with Andrew Bolt last night, Nicola. He was superb. Now, remembering, he's out there. Bolt, you can see, has to play Mr. Cool and Mr. in the middle and rah. And Chris, he says what he has to say, and then he shuts his mouth because he who speaks next loses. He played it beautifully. Full credit. Now, I have been saying, earlier in the week, the necessary component of citizen journalists who've become independent media who now need to turn professional. And this is the point. Now that the way Chris handled himself, he deserves to be considered a professional. He deserves to draw an income from what he's doing, and he holds his own against Andrew Bolt, who's supposed to be on our side of the fence. Chris has broken an incredible story, and Sky News was smart enough to take it on. But of course, they're going to obfuscate at this point because, the legal people are going to get in. You're now going to have to be dealing with, spy agencies. This is as big as it gets. And I know that we are putting ourselves into the fire at this point, but what we are doing is simply reporting the facts of the day, and we are going to get called misinformation, etc. And I will make this point. Tucker Carlson nails the term misinformation with his trademark hysterical giggle that he does when he bursts out laughing when you say misinformation. He says there's no such thing as misinformation. There can only be truth and there can only be lies. And when the government calls misinformation, it is because it has set out a certain narrative, and those people out there have come back at them with certain facts that disproves their narrative, and therefore government has been caught in a lie, and they are obfuscating the truth, and they scream misinformation. So there it is. The facts are out there. We will continue to mine for facts with reporters like Chris, with the work that Morgan Jonas is doing in Victoria, and I'm sure Topher Field's now going to take this up. I'm sure Maria Z's going to take it up, and I'm sure Jamie McIntyre over at Australian National Review will be onto it today. So you can already see in the background the usual suspects in the independent media. This is the story of the year so far, and it could get much bigger.
It's the story of the century for Australia, I'll be honest, because to see the members of what we're told, is a public Labour Party meeting be exclusively Chinese, sitting in the red, may I say, Labour T-shirts and excluding Australians from entering that meeting, and knowing that Andrews pulled out at the last minute, this is explosive. This is as big as it gets. I think with the leadership of Anthony Albanese, it is now clear that the Labour Party is compromised. They have undergone a coup d'etat, whether it's communist China, likely, or just communists in general. The Labour Party, if you vote for them in any way, you're voting for communists. That's what they've announced. We didn't do this. They're the ones who shut Australians out of their Chinese-only meeting. And so what I want to know is the Liberal Party compromised as well? Because if they are, things need a dramatic change in Australia, Jason.
I don't know if we're going to be now at a point where that component has now meant that we're going to have a trigger point, but at least now we have got something that we can certainly point to the actual division in Australian politics and what it is, the motivation. Now, we're going to get into the news headlines in a moment. It is a very, very large bulletin. There's one story that I'm not going to include in there because it might fall into discussion, and that's just so people can understand the format of the show. We put together a big bulletin every day. It takes about 5 or 6 minutes to give you all the big stories of the day, and we then go on and discuss. But there's one particular story in relation to Albanese and AUKUS that's broken in the news.com.au website today, and I find it very interesting because what we're now seeing in real time for those that have got their lenses on and focused is it's crucial. We're now seeing if Albanese is tied to the CCP and he's involved in AUKUS, this is exactly what it means to be controlled opposition. He's literally he's serving two masters if this is the case. Massive allegation, remains to be proven, but you cannot serve two masters, and this is when you get compromised politics. This is when those that have got genuine arm's length separation from all of these organised interests come to their own. I'm hoping that Senator Rennick comes back to me today and says, Jason, you're onto something. I'm hoping that the Libertarians will be able to have a conversation with them later today and say you're onto something. I'm going to challenge them all on behalf of you, the listener, and all Australians, because I think that there is something a lot more here. And if these people are too timid to say, well, we're going to need new leadership, I'm going to reach out to Ralph Babette as well, and we'll also possibly reach out to Russell Broadbent. I think that's a good spectrum of people on our side of the fence, and we'll let them have an opportunity. This is a story we won't give up on, and we'll work on it through next week as we move.
I'd like to call for the resignation of Anthony Albanese based on that meeting and how Australians were treated. I'd like to call for his resignation immediately. He's not going to come out and explain himself, so resign. Yep.
Well, you've nailed it. And if you're not going to hand in your resignation, maybe the Australian people will hand it to you in May. I'll tell you what, I'm not very motivated at all by Peter Dutton, and I hate the way that prime ministers arrive at the lodge by literally their opposition prime minister stumbling and tripping over. And these guys, it's almost like what's his name in the ice skating? Goodness me, the Australian that won it. The ice skating when everyone else fell over. Why do I always forget these names in the heat of the moment? Anyway, it'll come to me in a minute. But it's one of those moments. I feel like Peter Dutton is literally going to skate to victory because Albanese is going to fall over at the winning post. And yet both of them are as bad as each other. Never before have we had a platform to finally bring the third parties together. I had occasion yesterday to meet up with a friend of mine who once ran for the Great Australian Party, the GAP Party, quite a few elections ago in the early days. He was responsible for developing Rod Culleton's cannabis policy, just as an aside, and I thought that was really interesting, that Rod's got a very progressive cannabis policy for those that want to check that out. And again, this is what I'm saying. I'm reaching out to everyone.
I don't FYI, listeners, have a progressive cannabis policy because I've seen the damage it can do. But anyway, carry on, Jason.
So this is to do with medicinal cannabis and the benefits in that space. So it's an important part that people need to know, that on this side, as many people that can come to the centre to understand how we deal with certain things, because the more we learn, the more we realise we don't know as much as those that we do, but we can no longer sit on our hands anymore and accept that the system has to be the way that it does. I think there is a time and a place, and real leadership will emerge at this time, just as real media is emerging. I couldn't be prouder of the work that we've all done up until this point. It's been a bloody long time for most of us. You know, some of us our whole lives, some of us the last 5 years, some of us 10 or 15 years longer. But here we are, and finally starting to get ahead. Let's get into that bulletin now, and we'll come out and we'll continue this conversation because it is a ripper. So in what is possibly the biggest story of the year so far, Bruyne of Chriscoveries has recorded video of a Labor Party event in the Melbourne Eastern Suburbs electorate of Deakin. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is now calling on Australians to buy local as the government reels from the impact to the Australian steel and aluminium industry, which has been slapped with a 25% levy, rather than retaliate with tit-for-tat tariffs, something he argues would only drive up inflation. The Prime Minister urged Australians to show economic patriotism in a series of radio interviews on Wednesday. Albanese stopped short of advocating the outright boycott of US goods. His messaging aligns with Labor's broader push to prioritise local manufacturing. The upcoming federal budget is expected to have an Australian-made focus, with the government looking at ways to use its own $100 billion procurement budget to boost local suppliers, something Labor promised before the 2022 election, but of course is yet to implement. It's amazing how the progressives become the reactionaries when the heat is on. A fire has broken out at the Surfers Paradise Hilton Hotel on the Gold Coast, with shot footage capturing a ball of flames dropping from the roof of the building. Emergency services were called to the hotel at about 2 a.m. on Friday. Meanwhile, EU President Ursula von der Leyen has made a statement on X that Europe has all it needs to take the lead in the competitive race. This month, the EU will unveil the Savings and Investment Union. She said, "We will turn private savings into much-needed investment, and we will work with the institutional partners to get it off the ground. In other words, we are broke, you are not, and you will have no say where your money goes, as we will partner with the banks to bail you in whether you like it or not." Meanwhile, President Trump says the EU was formed with the sole purpose of taking advantage of the United States. Thousands of jobs to be cut after Keir Starmer has announced the NHS England will be abolished to cut bureaucracy and bring management of the health service back into democratic control. Donald Trump has spoken out on the ongoing negotiations with Russia and Ukraine. He says that parts of the final agreement are being worked out, such as land ownership, the Zaporizhzhia power plant, etc. Trump once again confirms NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table. The important thing, both Putin and Zelensky are open to the idea of a ceasefire, and negotiations to end this war are underway. Putin just wants to make sure that this is not an opportunity for Ukraine to regroup, given Russia has the significant advantage on the battlefield and are advancing across all fronts. Putin wants this to be a permanent solution, writes Bruce Snyder of Mindfix TV. Trump would later go on to say that he's open to meeting directly with Putin, and Bruce argues that this is exactly where this is all headed. Trump and Putin have to meet face-to-face sooner rather than later. Wouldn't be surprised if a Trump-Putin summit is around the corner. And in a further development of our story yesterday on the election result in Greenland, where leading party in the elections, the ironically labelled Democrat Party, who supports independence from Denmark, Trump said in front of the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, "I think the annexation of Greenland will happen." A protest by Democrats for detained Palestinian Columbia University student Mahmoud Khalil broke out inside Trump Tower in New York, similarly dressed in red shirts. While the police chief explained on Fox News his department had handled over 5,000 protests, this one was unlawful and dismantled in under 2 hours, with all 150 in attendance asked to leave. Of that, 98 who stayed and occupied the cafeteria were all arrested and placed on police buses and will be charged with Class A misdemeanor offences related to their behaviour, including resisting arrest. There were no injuries and no property damage. President Trump is expected to invoke the Aliens Enemies Act of 1798, a sweeping wartime authority, in the coming days. The law historically used during world wars would allow Trump to swiftly deport individuals deemed a national security threat. Officials are finalising details with an announcement expected as soon as tomorrow. The White House has also directed the US military to draw up options for increasing the American troop presence in Panama to achieve Trump's goal of reclaiming the Panama Canal, according to two US officials familiar with the planning. During a joint address to Congress last week, Trump said, to further enhance our national security, my administration will be reclaiming the Panama Canal. Since then, administration officials have not said what reclaiming means. US Southern Command is developing potential plans, from partnering more closely with the Panamanian military to the less likely option of US troops seizing the canal by force. There are concerns about who was actually making important choices during former President Biden's administration after a government watchdog accused the Biden administration of using an auto pen to sign almost all of his executive orders. An electromechanical tool that accurately mimics a person's signature is called an auto pen. Presidents of the United States and other high-ranking authorities occasionally use it to sign a lot of documents without consulting them directly. Every document bearing Biden's signature, save for the letter declaring his withdrawal from the 2024 race, appears to have been created with an auto pen, according to an analysis by the Oversight Project, a branch of the Heritage Foundation. Mike Johnson questioned the president about his decision to halt liquid natural gas exports once they were alone in the Oval Office. I cannot answer this from my constituents in Louisiana, Johnson recalled telling Biden. Sir, why did you pause LNG exports to Europe? Liquefied natural gas is in great demand by our allies. Why would you do that? Because you understand we just talked about Ukraine. You understand you are fueling Vladimir Putin's war machine because they got to get their gas from him. Biden replied, I didn't do that, which Johnson said left him stunned. He genuinely did not know what he had signed, Johnson said, and I walked out of that meeting with fear and loathing because I thought we are in serious trouble. Who is running the country? Like, I don't know who put the paper in front of him, but he didn't know. And the final story, FAA supervisor has been caught on tape helping DEI applicants cheat on air traffic controller exams. And Elon Musk warned about this on Joe Rogan not 3 weeks ago. Nicola.
So you mentioned there, before we move on to the other news, about people in red shirts at Trump Tower. Is that right?
Correct. These were
red
Democrat
shirts.
protesters.
After what we just talked about at the head of the show, everyone in red shirts at this Labour public meeting that the public, unless they were Chinese, were not invited to. And we've got red shirts over there at Trump Tower. And I just put red shirts into Google, and what comes up from 2022, the Victorian Ombudsman releases report on Labour Party's red shirt scandal, where in 2018, Mr. Glass found that Labour had misused $388,000 of public money through the red shirts rort. And I've blown up this picture, and it's Daniel Andrews with lots of young, probably communists now, we know, standing around with him in their red shirts. And interestingly, in the background is a handmade poster that says it's the final countdown. What is going on, Jason?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It feels like that all the planets have aligned for independent news to make its take its place now on centre stage. There are so many stories that
dark is going on with the Australian Labor Party. That is clear.
So we now have to ask some very serious questions, and we're going to have to reach out to all of our known resources now to see who wants to speak publicly about this in terms of the relationship now between China and the Labor Party. Yeah. And the point being that in China, there's one political party, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and that has been known to infiltrate. We already have a great lead in Sam Dastyari, the former Labor. He was the General Secretary who became the Senator, and he didn't last very long in federal politics as a Senator because he had to stand down due to his Chinese connections. So there is runs on the board, there is form here. So we really have to start digging. This is going to be extraordinary. Now, Dastyari was a former politician born in 1983. He was a senator, would you believe, from the age of 30 to the age of 35 before he had to walk out of office just in disgrace, effectively, over the Chinese-related donations scandal. And he resigned on the 25th of January 2018. So we will start digging with this over the weekend, and we'll continue with this story. But this is absolutely massive.
And what's interesting is, China is a dictatorship. right? People are treated very poorly. They still keep slaves if they disagree with you religiously. They keep over 1 million male slaves, the Uyghurs. They rip them from their families, I think from the age of about 9 years old. And they force them to work at gunpoint. They starve them. They mistreat them. They're literally in chains. And our countries, and I've said for a long time, disgracefully continue to do commerce and trade with China. And so does the UN, without any sanctions regarding the keeping of slaves. Now, this links into another story. I genuinely think with things like this, communism and the Labour Party, you give these people enough rope and they hang themselves. And that's what's happened with this public meeting. They've hung themselves here. So then the other story is that Ursula von der Leyen of the European Union, and the European Union absolutely love China. They see China as sort of the business and social model. Has now publicly announced, again, enough rope, they'll hang themselves, that we're looking at bail-ins in the EU where, they've run out of money for investments, so they'll just use yours. Okay, now what happens in a dictatorship like China? What's yours, what's mine, what's yours is mine, and what's mine's my own, right? That's how it works. You're not allowed to have anything. You're not allowed to own land or keep assets. And if you do accumulate any assets, then the state takes it. Now, I found out in a court case late last year that Victorian police officers are no longer sworn into the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth is the common people, right? The wealth of the common people, which means they're not sworn to serve and protect you. No, they're sworn into the state. That means, incidentally, they have no jurisdiction over you. So things are changing here. We are becoming potentially a communist state. So you talked about last week, wouldn't it be great? We could temporarily or permanently become a state of America and we could be free and get a Bill of Rights. I feel like there is a power struggle to win Australia between the good side of America, certainly not the deep state, because they're in with China, and that's the problem. They're sold out and taking money. And we know factually that Biden took, 30 million at least from China and paid visits to China with Hunter Biden on Air Force Two when he was vice president to Barack Obama. So the connections leading to China are extraordinary. The influence we see in Australia is extraordinary. For those who are not on the ground here in Australia, we've got virtually every sort of $2 shop, lottery store, post office, are all Chinese run now. And I have to say, these dots are not connecting in a fabulous way. Now, I think our guest today has joined the show, Jason.
Yeah, indeed. We've got him on the show. Now, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction here before I bring Ross on. So Ross Cameron is an Australian politician who was a sitting member of the seat of Parramatta for the Liberal Party between the years 1996 and 2004, serving in the Howard government. Ross has since departed that party and is now the state president of New South Wales for the Libertarian Party. And we reached out to Ross earlier in the week on the issue of the combining of the parties in the joint ticket under the Australia First Alliance. But since things have heated up, I hope Ross is all over what's happening now in Deakin, in the seat of Deakin down with the Labor Party in this particular revelation. Ross Cameron, welcome for the first time to the Daily Australian.
Yeah, good morning. It's good to join you.
Terrific to have you on the show, Ross. What a week it is in politics. This revelation by Christa Bruyne, this video that's come out of Deakin at the Box Hill Town Hall, where Australians have been excluded specifically, even with invitations, for joining this particular Labor event. And we've seen Penny Wong sneak out in the background, Daniel Andrews cancel at the last minute, and Karina Garland, who has links to the Search Foundation, which is a communist arm. We are scratching our heads, Ross. Have we stumbled across possibly a bigger story than even Chris has uncovered?
Well, look, I must admit, I've seen the headlines. I don't know what that story really means. But it's obviously, an extraordinary thing for a major Australian political party to exclude people from an event by race.
It's racism, isn't it, Ross? Isn't that racism?
By any other definition,
I think it is. but it seems to fly in the face of the idea of the inclusive sort of multicultural society that Labor is allegedly building.
I'm staggered by the fact that the party of diversity, equity, inclusion that throws it in your face and wants to punish you if you don't participate. And you had Daniel Andrews saying the most obscene things to parents in relation to this whole trans issue, literally taking parental rights away from the parent and into the school teacher. The Daniel Andrews behaviour during COVID, if for mine, I now think that that's the blueprint of how a communist dictator would have run a state during COVID, the way that he behaved. And now that we've got this particular situation here, I can't help but see the CCP red and yellow flag, slamming me in the face. We did an interview yesterday with Trevor Loudon, who wrote the book Comrade PM, about Albanese's affiliations with the Communist Party over a period of 40 years. Serious questions must be asked and put to the Prime Minister, because we've found documents that we can't necessarily verify, but they point to obvious advances in what Labor policy may well be. I mean, how far is it before Labor, if they are returned, would come up with something obscene like introducing an inheritance tax, for instance, and trying to push that through if they get some sort of control in the Parliament? Why would that be considered too far? And why shouldn't we talk about such a thing, Ross?
Yeah, well, I think that what we saw during COVID was the speed at which very ancient rights could be eroded and destroyed. And, there's a scene in one of I'm pretty sure it was Hemingway's books, where two guys are chatting and one says to the other, "How did you go bankrupt?" And he said, at first slowly and then quickly. And I think the same thing happens to nations, that you can have a gradual corrosive influence over several decades, and then suddenly the thing can just virtually implode. And we've got multiple trend lines across Australia, whether you're looking at productivity or demographics or public expenditure, NDIS swallowing the whole Commonwealth budget, etc. But I appreciate, there's plenty of there's always been a somewhat, there's always been some tension in the Australia-China relationship. I mean, the Chinese played a very big role, for example, in the early gold rush, but it led to the differences in culture led to a range of tensions. And I just say that the difficulty Australia is now facing, in my judgment, is that we are, on the one hand, very badly, we've worked for a decade to badly damage our relationship with the current US leadership, at the same time as taking a significantly more hostile attitude towards, I would say, the foreign policy establishment has taken a more hostile attitude towards China. But it just means Australia is at significant risk of falling between stools, where we have no significant trading partner. And, under some scenarios, we could see the Australian dollar falling, I think, below 40 cents US on the current trend, because of this obsession with, you refer to diversity, equity, inclusion. We might add climate change, sexuality, racism.
But it's Maoism, Ross. That's Maoism. When you want no boys and girls and everyone to be the same, that's Maoism.
Yeah. Well, I'm inclined to agree with you. I mean, it's what we might call the globalist agenda. We sort of see, interestingly, there's no sort of individual candidate for the, quote, globalist party, but we see the evidence of this doctrine, this sort of extreme anti-human green left collectivist, you would say Maoist. I don't really, I wouldn't really argue with you. I think it has strong Maoist elements. but there is this permanent attack on the family and the permanent adoration of the state.
Yes.
And this idea of, and you talk about Daniel Andrews, whether it was Daniel Andrews or Gladys Berejiklian or, the West Australian Premier, there was this sort of desire to get the big state, we will protect you, to put the population into a state of complete panic and fear. And for the government, in Anthony Albanese's language, to be the answer to these problems. And I guess, we should also admit that the Australian people have not covered themselves in glory in our response to these developments. And what we have discovered, the Western Australia, which had, very severe COVID-related laws and restrictions on mobility, they've just re-elected a Labor government for, I think, a third time. Labor suffered effectively no penalty, actually improved their position as a consequence of these draconian, lockdown laws.
I find this hard to believe that happened, I'll be honest.
So what do we, I think might have been Jay Bacciaria or one of the, was it Philippe? I'm trying to remember which of the COVID leading lights it was who said that, 3 countries in the world that most completely lost their minds, take your pick on the order, were Canada, New Zealand and Australia. And, I just think we've got to admit that the Australian people bear some of the responsibility for the ease with which we were swept into this, quote, pandemic.
What can they do
quote.
about it, Ross? You're blaming the Australian people there for the actions of bureaucrats. What can the Australian populace do about that?
Yeah, well, I'm saying I'm saying we are complicit, and that when Australians were sort of invited to dob on each other, and the dob in a COVID breach hotline, this kind of thing, and the extent to which people were prepared to voluntarily enforce, sanctions, social sanctions for any kind of breach. We just sort of swallowed the narrative in a way that I found disappointing.
Odious. Yeah.
Yeah, look,
Jason.
Just when you sort of backtrack on it, but you at some point you have to say to the Australian people, yeah, we are responsible for our own actions, but the collective weight under which people will put under that stress and fear. Now, I only read out yesterday that the definition of terrorism is achieving or attempting to achieve a political goal by instilling fear in the population, and that's in relation to Hamas. But if you
a war crime, Jason, a war crime is when you're taking those actions against civilians, which is what we saw.
Well, this is where we're at, right? Because you can't argue in the sense that COVID fear was, at the very least, it was overblown and misdirected and marginalised, and it was all about fear. So you have to draw parallels within the government, the global government system that made it sort of trickle down the way that it did, the obfuscation of Tedros and the WHO saying we never said any of this stuff, and what's his name? Fauci saying, mask yes, mask no, all the usual, obfuscation and as I've said earlier on the show, that the idea that the left has this ability to take two sides on every story so they can be right on any given day and just presume that we forget what they said earlier. It's become that obvious. So interestingly, in Trevor Loudon's interview that I encourage for the second time in the show for people to go check out the 45-minute interview I did with him yesterday, he made a number of great points, but one of them was, he said, in his opinion, it's not Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and the globalists who hold the power. He says China holds the power on this globalist structure.
Well, someone's paying them, Jason. Daniel Andrews is worth tens of millions of dollars. Someone is paying them. Follow the money.
So there's an obvious thing. And what does that bring us into? Who did we interview last week on the show? Charles Ortel, who is probably the world's preeminent expert on charity fraud and exposed General Electric's accounting fraud. He's number one on the Clinton Foundation. He exposed Obama, Biden, Bush shenanigans as well. We'll have to reach out to Charles, because in the end of that interview, I did ask him what would be your approach to Australia, and he delivered some very interesting perspectives there on what you might do involving charity fraud. So this thing is global. It's frighteningly obvious now that we are dealing with a number of players. But the point I want to make about Trevor, he said you could get rid of Klaus Schwab tomorrow and you could install someone there. So therefore, in his opinion, China held more power than the globalists. But my question was, are the globalists and the communists effectively the same thing? And he described it as overlap. Please check out the story. Ross, we've got to pivot now because I only got you for a couple more minutes. But what I wanted to ask you, this development with the Australia First Alliance in relation to your party, the Libertarians, Michael O'Neill's party at the Heart Party, and Gerard Rennick's People First Party, this has met with so much enthusiasm and encouragement. And I wanted to ask you, do you share the same sentiments, and where to from here? What's the next steps in the lead up to the election and then beyond?
Yeah, well, Jason, you're obviously, scratching an itch here, and this has been one of the problems for us is that, you take a guy like Gerard Rennick, whose sort of trade policies I don't love, but everything else about him I absolutely love. And he's been one of the sort of 7 or so senators who have been prepared, in my judgment, to advocate for the Australian people rather than for the government against the Australian people. But the problem for the right, for what I would call the common sense end of the political spectrum, has been our fragmentation, that we have been splintered. We have suffered these fissures based around partly personality, a range of organic ways in which parties split and grew up. But what it has meant is that the left side of politics has remained a pretty effectively solid phalanx between the Greens and Labor, even though Labor's primary vote has continued to fall. The Greens pull Labor to the left. And when it comes time, when we're in the voting booth, you don't find the left preferences splintering across multiple minor parties. It's just Labor and the Greens, depending on how fast you wish the decline to be. Whereas on the right, we've had, the Liberal National Coalition. Then we've had One Nation, we've had United Australia Party, we've now got Trumpet of Patriots, and the Libertarian Party, formerly Liberal Democrats, among others, Heart. And if you looked at the combined vote of each of those minor right parties in each of the states, for example, there are enough votes there to win a rational, sort of patriotic senator in every state. But because of the levels of wastage and splintering of the vote, we have tended to, miss the opportunity to get a rational senator elected. And so the Libertarians have had this concern and have been advocating for greater level of cooperation and collaboration between the minor parties. We have talked about, we have been open to the idea even of mergers, but this is a first step. And so in New South Wales, the Libertarians will be running a Senate ticket with Craig Kelly at number 1. We will then have the Heart Party at number 2. Michael O'Neill will then have People First, Gerard Rennick's party at number 3. We're not sure yet who their candidate will be. And we, in fact, have expressed clearly that, we're open to other parties joining us. And it's really just an expression of, on our part, it's sort of led by John Ruddick and supported by Craig Kelly, where John wrote an article with The Spectator and said, look, we can't just be talking about collaboration. We've got to develop a practical model. And you asked me the question, well, where to from here? I mean, we'll see this as the first step. then we've been talking about the idea of a sort of major congress of the right parties. And Ruddock's model is that we should actually hold primaries in each state where members of each, for the Senate position in particular, which that winnable last spot on the Senate ticket.
No, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. And so, because the hope is, I mean, there's always a range of reasons. The parties don't agree about everything. I mean, I think we now, under the current leadership of the Libertarian parties, there's basically no difference between us and Hart, the former IMOP party. But that was really formed when the former David Leyonhjelm, I think it was, voted for no jab, no job or something like that. So that was an own goal by the formerly Liberal Democrats. But now we're in complete alignment, and it seems, crazy to be maintaining the infrastructure of two parties who agree on everything. Then you go to the others, whether it's, say the Libertarians and One Nation would have probably, I would say, 80% agreement, something like that. Trumpet of Patriots, likewise, there'd be a high level of overlap. But say for Libertarians who always, encourage freedom and free markets. I see Clive Palmer's just given an address to the press club in which he will sort of want to introduce state control of interest rates, not something that Libertarians would support, but we nonetheless recognise that, we would say they are on the right track, and their support for the Trumpian overturning of the tables of the globalists' commercial machine, we would be 100% in support of. And so that would be potentially, the ways in which the parties can cooperate is to agree to tight preference deals would be the simplest. The next would be to run joint tickets for the Senate. The next would be running primaries where the parties retain their separate identity but actually choose candidates together. And then the last would be a full merger, probably the most difficult. So that's the kind of direction that the stream is flowing in.
It's admirable.
I think, Ross, it is absolutely. It's brilliant. At long last, the party on the right side of the fence, as opposed to the left, not the wrong, to be as fair as possible, is starting to organise, which is something that the parties of the left are based upon, is union organisation, obviously. So this means that we are headed towards the working title of one merged unity party amongst those that primarily agree 80% or better, and you've named Hart, Libertarians, Trumpet of Patriots, Pauline Hanson's One Nation, Gerard Rennick's People First, and I'll throw in there at the bottom also the Citizens Party and the Freedom Party in Victoria are also very interested. And the other interesting thing, Ross, I've noticed is that there is a real consolidation and a recognition of preserving resources. And so I noticed that Morgan Jonas came out the other day and said he'll only be running 5 lower house candidates for the Freedom Party in Victoria, specifically in marginal seats, recognising the need to be able to consolidate resources. Now, I know Gerard's worked really hard in the Parliament to get this 4% rule dropped, perhaps, so that, and also by using a joint ticket to be able to get to 4%, so that we can put some money back into the political parties through the system that the established parties get to use. So it's just understanding the process with a little bit more maturity and a little bit more accuracy to tap into a legitimate system that's used by the other parties to strengthen what is this third party movement. And we have to say we are certainly looking a lot better than the rabble in 2022. We were looking like a rabble in late 2024. But isn't it interesting? One little move, and all of a sudden, organisation and the third-party movement is really gathering confidence and momentum.
Well, they're better organised, Jason. That's why they've done better, and they've planned this for a very long time, for decades. And unfortunately, it's left Australia so far left-leaning that the country is being ripped apart and sold off, and our resources being raped and pillaged. So we have to drag this country out of the left-hand bucket of politics because it's not working. It's breaking the nation.
I want to make this nuanced point. We are not hive-minded on this side. In fact, we support self-sufficiency and free will more than anything else, and freedom. But the very fact that you realise that we had to let 2022 run its own race, and even as we approach 2025 with the free will, but the ability to then willingly want to work together, as Ross has outlined, and it's a genuine process, and it might take years to do it, Ross. But the point is that there is a plan, and you come willingly. No one is being forced to join the joint ticket, are they?
No, it's a voluntary process, and Nicola's point is right that the left culturally derive a benefit from their attraction to collectivism when it comes to political organisation, and the willingness of Labor have the rule in the Parliament, for example, that if any member of the ALP crosses the floor on a vote in the Parliament, they will be expelled from the caucus. So,
no independent thought allowed.
Yeah. So they're just upfront about that. They don't sort of pretend that they're individuals exercising a mandate delivered to them by 100,000 voters. They just say, no, I just accept the fact that I'm a widget in a machine that puts its, like Pavlov's dog. We put up our hand when we're told to, and we put it down when we're told to. But what it does mean is then it's harder to organise the right because we are by temperament more naturally individualist who have a profound respect for freedom of conscience. And so that means it's a bit like herding cats, and we've got to find a way through to overcome the glory of the self-governing citizen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ross, now he might have just hit the mute button. I think we've just lost him there for a second. I'll just see if we can get him. Oh, there we go. Sorry, Ross, I think the mute button got hit. Are you back?
Mate, just when I was giving the Gettysburg Address. So I'm just reflecting on the fact that, our resilient attachment to individual freedom and conscience can be a liability when it comes to organising a political force to get people elected to Parliament, which requires recruiting volunteers, recruiting donations, recruiting party members, getting people to stand on polling booths, putting up signs in people's front yards, having scrutineers to count the vote afterwards. All of those things, it's a logistical sort of mechanics operation that requires concentrated effort and teamwork. And we've got to get better at that on the right side of Australian politics.
You couldn't say it any better. The business of politics, and it's done with blood, sweat, and tears and donations, and it's the most unglamorous, unwanted job that anyone could do, is the necessary work that you must do, the groundwork, the grassroots work that will change Australia. Just quickly, we'll make this the last question, and then we'll have to wrap up the show, Nicola. But if you put, and I just need an estimation, I don't need anything accurate. If you put Heart, Libertarians, Trumpet of Patriots, Pauline Hanson One Nation, People First, Citizens, Freedom, and any other parties that you can think of, what kind of membership base do you think we could be working with, say now and perhaps in another year or so? Do you think we could get as many as 500,000 paid members in this combined joint ticket that one day must merge?
Well, I think so. I think you wind up having the Canadians were the first, and it's one of the reasons why we like the idea of an all-party primary to select the best candidates in each state. Is the Canadians, once they the sort of Reform Party in Canada, after the Conservatives fragmented and broke up, a new Libertarian / Conservative / Nationalist Party emerged, and they gave the membership the right to choose the leader of the party. And that single decision, plus plebiscites to select candidates, it was a truly democratic movement. They went in Canada quickly to a membership of 700,000 people. in just the one party because it was democratic and because people felt they had the opportunity to participate. So, I think Clive is saying he's gone from nothing to 20,000 in this new trumpet. But yeah, I think that's where we have to be. The truth is, to win a full Senate quota in Victoria and Queensland, you need about 450,000 votes. In New South Wales, it's probably 550,000 to win the full quota.
Mm-hmm.
The minor right usually winds up scrapping with 10 other parties for the last spot, with on occasion people getting elected under preference arrangements with a relatively small number of votes. When people point to the UAP, Ralph Babbitt, who won with 50,000 votes in a franchise of sort of 500,000. Ricky Muir has actually won. I think he won with 12,000 votes, which is like the world record. But if we want to be confidently sure, that we can get a senator elected, and frankly, if we had, if we could get 6 really patriotic, Australia-loving, there for the right reason, libertarian, conservative, rebuild Australia, elected, one in each state in this cycle, then we could get another 6 elected in the next cycle. If you had 12 in the Senate, you could really start exercising influence, help to turn the ship around. And that's what we need, the sort of numbers you're talking about. We need nationwide, 700,000 members.
Well, that's interesting. So 700,000 is a magic number. If you think that if each member was able to contribute $40 to a membership, you've now got a $28 million combined fighting fund. If you then get those types of votes that you've just explained there, and I'm just going to quickly add them up, 450,000 in Victoria, in Queensland, and then 550,000 in those 3 states. That's 1.5 million votes, give or take. At $3.50 a vote, that's another $5 million that you are awarded naturally as part of the process. So now you're talking, you've got over $33 million in a fighting fund. This makes you, in a merged situation, a very serious political party, Ross.
Yeah, well, the Libertarians, contrarian as we are, have the view that getting paid for votes is improper policy-wise. Now, frankly, when we get 4%, we'll still take the money. We have taken the money. But it is part of the racket, which makes the incumbent much more powerful than the challenger. And, the basic mechanics of it are that if you get 4% of the vote, you get $3.50 for every vote you receive. Now, the democratic, the difference between the movement or party that gets 3.99% of the vote, maybe falls 1 vote short and gets nothing. Whereas we know the Liberals, Nationals, Greens and Labor know, because they are the establishment, they can confidently get above that hurdle every time. And so you just get this sandbagging effect. But, I think you're right to point out that if they are the rules, then they are the rules that we must play by until we can change them.
Correct.
And it would certainly create, once you're regularly hitting that 4% target, you can fund the whole machinery, the administrative, even just the administrative burden of remaining compliant with the requirements of the Australian Electoral Commission or the New South Wales Electoral Commission, the Queensland. It's a complex and difficult operation, and it requires a sort of party bureaucracy to comply with all these rules. And that would be, as you say, if we could be hitting that magic 4% of the vote number, aside from getting more people elected, it does drop us into this trough of taxpayer cash, which the major parties are currently using against us.
Correct. So you've got to use the system to beat the system, but it shows, Nicola, once again, we have to professionalise the third-party movement. We need to bring that money in so that we can have paid administrative staff to fulfil the duties required to be considered a professional political organisation. And this is why people were frustrated with Clive when he decided not to go down that pathway, pardon me, to seemingly save money by not being fulfilling those administrative tasks and by closing down between elections.
Terrible. Yeah,
Now,
terrible.
So for what might have been a $5 million of the $100 million budget to more than amply run that process, but also to build a significant branch structure and to bring in the rank and file, the grassroots that you need to man the booths and do all that hard work in that two-week election cycle of voting, which is unbearably difficult when it's just you and your wife and your kids that are handing out at booths. This is as hard as it gets, but it's just an important part of the infrastructure. Ross, there's so much that you've been able to bring to the table to the third party movement. Your experience with the in the Howard government has been invaluable. All of us on this side of the fence get knocked, some of which we're all imperfect, and we get knocked around and we stand up and we keep going. How important is it in politics to be resilient? I'll make this the last question, Nicola.
You said that the last two.
But it's such a brilliant interview, and I'm forever grateful that Ross is being so candid. I mean, it just seems so normal, but the thing is, it's invaluable education for our listeners. What do we do? What do we say?
Well, I think it was Friedrich Nietzsche who said that the only test of a man is that he endures. And frankly, those who are prepared to put their head above the parapet, those who are prepared to stand against the current, and for example, during the COVID lockdown, social distance, mandatory injections, vaccine passports, blah blah blah, it took a great deal of guts, and people suffered significant economic harm and sort of social exclusion. Who were prepared to take the principled stand. Now they're being overwhelmingly vindicated now, but at the time it's incredibly difficult. And this is where I'm to some extent influenced also by the Stoics, who say there's two categories of things in your life, and they are those over which you have influence and control, and those you don't. And the Stoics would say, you must just focus and concentrate on only those things within your control and remain, in effect, undisturbed by the others. And that's a personal, a personal challenge for each of us. I think we all make various compromises along the way. Epictetus said that, every man has a price. It's a question of how cheaply we will sort of sell ourselves for. And
I agree.
This movement is just trying to get us, to put a higher price on our own freedom of thought, speech, conscience, movement, etc., than we have previously.
Ross, may I just say thank you for coming on the show, and I love your voice. You need to do more radio.
Oh, you're very sweet. I'll definitely keep coming back with that sort of encouragement.
There you go. Kill them with kindness, we say. Fabulous. Ross, thanks so much for being on the show. Nicola, I think this has been a significant episode 50 in the Daily Australian Radio Show. We're maturing in real time, just like the independent media is, just like the third party movement is. More power to everyone on this side of the fence, and at long last you can sort of see the organisational structure. It's almost as if the magnet picking up the iron filings, if you will, for an old class school experiment. It just feels like we are turning a quarter. We should be enormously proud of what we've been able to achieve.
And we need to do that. We need to change the status quo. And things are going very downhill in Australia and in the UK. We reported earlier that Keir Starmer, in his wisdom, is going to abolish the NHS, which, isn't that just perfect timing? So you've made everyone sick, and now, just like an investment opportunity, the rug is going to be pulled out from all of these people that need as much medical help as possible. We are at DEFCON 5 in Australia. Things have to change. It's become extremely unfair, and this very offensive, and I would argue racist video that shows everyday Australians who live in the area being excluded from, for some reason, a non-public meeting by the Australian Labor Party has highlighted something extremely nefarious, and I think it's very important that we discuss it, Jason.
Yeah, indeed. Well, this is going to be the subject, obviously, big discussions over the weekend and next week as we reach out across the political spectrum for their feedback and just see how this story develops. But please check out the various different interviews and videos on shared. Nicola and I have shared them on the X page. The interview with Trevor Loudon. Please check out Krista Bruin's terrific video and also his interview on Sky News with Andrew Bolt and how he conducts himself. 10 out of 10, Chris. Well done. And continue to do the great work. There's so much more that we could talk about, Nicola, but I think we've had a great week, and I just want to say have a great weekend, everyone. The world is changing, and I stand by what we've said all along. We are the only independent news and opinion program where we chronicle two distinct possibilities, either the demise and possible extinction of the Homo sapien or the greatest leap forward in human history. And one thing is certain, there is no status quo.
And I would also add the potential communist coup d'etat of Australia. So thanks for Ross for coming on the show. Thank you to my co-host and co-producer, Jason Olborn. Thanks for listening again. Happy 50th to us. You've been wonderful listeners. Please let us know your comments on everything you've heard today. And I sincerely hope that you support both morally and also financially. Unfortunately, it's time to put your hands in your pockets. This new political movement in Australia, it's extremely important. That's it from us on the Daily Australian, episode 50. Have a great weekend. We will see you all again on Monday.